to education now. Well, leaders often say that it is the most powerful weapon that can change the world. But how powerful has this weapon been for Nigeria? To share insights into the 2022 budget from the Federal Ministry of Education, which is set at a proposed 876 billion naira, is Babajide Ogusowo, Data and Information Consultant. Great to have you here as always.
Good evening, Amarachi.
Good evening. So the figure sounds huge, 876 billion naira, but it isn't the largest that we've had so far in our history.
Yes, you're correct. 876 billion naira budget for education is the largest in our history. That's good news. But there's still some bad news, and I'll share the bad news with you later tonight. But Amarachi, today is important because exactly on this day, in 1945, the United Nations was born. So there are three things I'd like to talk about tonight. The first is to look at the United Nations guidelines on funding for education. The second is to look at Nigeria's own guidelines for how education is being funded. And finally, and perhaps the most important, will be to look at that connection between schooling and security. So first, let's take a look at the United Nations guidelines on how education should be funded. Based on their own guidelines for education for all, they look at between 15 to 20% of the government's expenditure, the government's budget, should go into funding. But the good news, like I shared earlier, is that between 2016 and 2020, the government, the President Buhari-led government, has doubled funding the budget to education. So we see in 2016, the proposed budget for education was 403 billion naira. Based on what was proposed in the 2022 budget of 876 billion naira, that is more than double what the budget was in 2016. But if we take a look at that third column, education budget as a percentage of the federal government's budget, that is where the bad news is. The bad news is that we are far from the United Nations guidelines of 15 to 20% of the government's budget should go to education. And we also see that in the last 6 years, the funding for education relative to the size of the Nigerian government's budget has also been declining. So in 2016, 403 billion naira to education as relative to a 6 trillion naira budget. That was 7% of the budget in 2016. In 2022, the budget is proposed to be 876 billion naira relative to the government's budget of 16.4 trillion naira, which is 5% of the budget. So in all, we see, yes, like I said, the first thing we need to talk about is the good news is in naira terms, we've seen the education budget double what it was in 2016, but relative to the United Nations guidelines of 15 to 20%, we are far from those guidelines. And even looking at what we're doing, we see that there's some challenge in being able to grow how much the government puts into education.
But does it move us further and closer to the UN guideline? And does the government have a long-term strategy for funding education?
So even though the government doesn't have a specific document that says that this is how we want to fund education in the long term, here what I've done is to put parts of it together. And the revelation shows that what the government is currently doing is funding education, health, and other community services, and putting about 14 to 17% of all government spending goes into education, health, and related community services. And here's what I mean. In 2016, as an example, out of the government's 5.8 trillion naira expenditure, actual expenditure, 844 billion naira went to funding education, health, and related community services. That was 14% of the government's budget. And that has been relatively been consistent since 2016 down to 2020. So in terms of strategy, like you asked, what we've seen is for every 100 naira the government spends, it spends approximately 15 naira on education, health, and related services. And that has been the government's real strategy since it came in 2015. And that is what has happened 2016 down to 2020.
Yeah, and you mentioned security earlier. So has there been any new research on the relationship between schooling And insecurity?
That's really where I want us to spend a bit more time if we have, because the question on the lips of Nigerians is that who are these vandals? Who are these bandits? Who are these terrorists? And tonight I'd like to provide a simple answer to that question, and I'd like you to listen carefully to what I'm about to say. Let's take a look at the fact of schooling in Nigeria, and if we take a look at what exactly is going on across all regions, it will provide us that answer. The fact shows that schooling, most children go into primary school, but they don't move into junior secondary school. So for instance, in the Southeast, 1.9 million people went into primary school, but only 661,000 got into junior secondary school. But let's look at these two regions that have given Nigerians sleepless nights, the Northeast and the Northwest. These are the two regions that have the lowest conversion rates. In the Northwest, 8.8 million children go into primary school, but only 1.4 million cross into junior secondary school. The question we need to ask ourselves is, where exactly did the 7.4 million children go to? Here's what I'm saying. 8 out of every 10 children that go into the primary school in northeastern and northwestern Nigeria, 8 out of 10 that get into the primary school never make it.
Where do they go?
That is the question. In other words, the vandals, the bandits, and the terrorists that are disturbing us are our children that we have failed to keep in school. That is the fact. We're seeing millions of children going into primary school, and we're seeing multiple millions not making it into secondary school. And that is the challenge. In the final analysis, Amarachi, let's not forget the words of the Chinese philosopher Confucius, who said that education is the vaccine for violence.
Thank you, Babajide. A lot to think about tonight as always, and thanks for being here.
The pleasure is all mine, Amarachi.